I'm very honored to be here. I don't normally speak to adults about the issues that I'm going to speak with. As Noel says, I have enormous faith in the young people. They get it. Anything that I'm going to tell you about your kids or grandkids can probably already tell you because they know this story. This is a story that's been passed by children. I'm here because I just want to say that, yeah, I was playing in a punk band in the 80s and I was a dropout. And for some reason, Jesuits started to come to our shows. Michael Czerny and Jim Webb and Michael Kolarchuk, Ed Sheridan, Martin Royackers played a huge role in my life in saying, yeah, you can go pick a fight, Charlie, but you're going to have to think about how you pick a fight. And I'd like to say that my political career has been an attempt to figure out how to pick a political fight to bring change. I'm going to start off by reading a little bit from my new book, Children of the Broken Treaty. And then I'm going to get into the issues of what we need to be looking at in terms of how to make reconciliation real. And part of it is understanding the pattern, that the system of the structure that was built by Duncan Campbell Scott is still very much in place. And unless you see the patterns of systemic discrimination, you may be fooled by all the positive talk. But talk doesn't change things. It's going to take political will. Young people are already changing it, but our generation have a responsibility to see the inequity, to see the injustice, to see what Cindy Blackstock calls a well-oiled machine of discrimination, which is the federal government. And we have to take that system apart. That's our job for the children. So I'm going to begin this book. It's called Children of the Broken Treaty, Canada's Lost Promise and One Girl's Dream. It begins with a line from Canadian Geographic that says, if Shannon Kustashian were alive, she would tell you this story herself. She feared nothing, that girl, not strangers, not defeat. And I get very emotional. I've never been able to speak about Shannon without crying, because when you see the power of young people and what we've lost and what we're losing. So excuse me if I get emotional. 10-year-old Hasna is telling the story in front of 600 students at Boxwood Public School in Markham. She is nervous and she fiddles with her PowerPoint presentation. A first-generation Muslim Canadian, Hasna has never done anything like this before. She isn't the type of girl who's comfortable standing out in a crowd, but the issue is important and she wants to do it justice. So she pulls herself together and she tells the children the story, the way Shannon would tell the story. And this is how it goes. Shannon Kustashian was a girl from the Cree First Nation who lived in a very poor community called Attawapiskat in the far north. She had never seen a real school. The children were being educated in broken down portables on a toxic site. Some of them were getting sick and losing hope. They had waited for years for the government to follow through on its promise to build them a school. But nothing ever changed. And then one day a government minister told the children they weren't getting a school at all. The children were heartbroken, but not Shannon. She said that what was happening to them was wrong. She told her classmates that education is a human right. School is a time for hope and dreams of the future, Shannon said. Every kid deserves this. Shannon and her friends went to Ottawa to challenge the government. They reached out to children across Canada. They formed clubs. They wrote letters to the Prime Minister. They held rallies, and the fight for a school in Attawapiskat became the largest youth-driven rights movement in Canadian history. Shannon had to leave home when she was 13 to get the kind of education that wasn't available on her reserve, and she was homesick having to leave her family. But she dreamed of becoming a lawyer. Unfortunately, she died in a car accident while living far from home. But the story doesn't end there. Other students came together to carry on her work, and thus was born the Shannon's Dream campaign to fight for the education rights of every Indigenous child in this country. Hasna looked up. The children are spellbound. Like her, most of them are first-generation Canadians. Their notion of Canada is a country built on fairness. Their confidence in the national character of inclusion is manifest in their school, a bright, open building where children are encouraged to become anything that they want. Shannon would call this a comfy school. But now that they've heard the story, they learn there's another Canada, where children are being denied basic rights. These students don't know much about the treaty that was signed by Shannon's people and the government, but they understand the meaning of a broken promise. This story of a young Cree leader who fought for education rights in Canada has been told in movies, a video, a novel, textbooks, and there's now a statue for her in Northern Ontario. DC Comics used the story of Shannon Kustashian as an inspiration for the latest member of the Justice League. In 2012, on the 600th anniversary of the birth of Joan of Arc, CBC host George Stroumboulopoulos placed Shannon Kustashian at the top of a list of 5 teenage girls who kicked ass in history. She was named alongside Joan of Arc, Mary Shelley, Anne Frank, and Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And the newly opened Human Rights Museum in Winnipeg features Shannon. This ongoing fascination with a girl from an impoverished reserve is even more striking because her public career was a scant 2 years, stretching from when Shannon challenged a minister of the Crown at the age of 13 to her death in a highway accident just before her 16th birthday. All in all, quite an impact for a girl who just wanted what every other child in this country wants, which is a chance to go to school. This book is about 2 places. It's about James Bay and it's about Ottawa. It is about the people who stood up to inequity and paved the way for a young leader like Shannon Kustashian. But it is also the story of those who were empowered to make a difference and chose not to. Among them are a comparatively small number of powerful people who showed criminal disregard for the Canadian People's Treaties. These players were aided and abetted by many people working in bureaucracies, agencies, and church orders who opted to serve the narrow interests of their organization above their obligation to do right. Now, this isn't to say there haven't been well-meaning people in these positions of responsibility. Over the decades, officials have commissioned countless reports on the state of education, child health, clean water, and so on. The various government departments dealing with Indigenous affairs have been subject to oversight by parliamentary hearings, and the Auditor General and the best bureaucratic minds were questioned and asked for explanation. But the unwillingness of these empowered people to take responsibility have left too many children in needless deprivation. This is why the story of Shannon Kustashian has such power. She cut through the bureaucratic fog. She spoke with the directness and the urgency of a child. She called on the government to stop hiding behind departmental misses and policy prevarications and be accountable as adults and parents. She asked them to explain why they have failed to protect the children. Which brings me back to Boxwood Public. As I step up to speak, a young student puts up her hand and says, "Did you really know Shannon?" Yes, I knew Shannon. Not a day goes by that I don't think of her. My thoughts remain a muddle of emotions and regret. But what I remember most is a young girl with a big heart who had a hell of a lot of moxie. But the answer I give is simple and affirmative. Shannon was just like you. She would be so proud to see that you're standing up. These students don't know the ins and outs of what has gone wrong with Canada's relationship with Indigenous people. They just know that children deserve better. This is perhaps the real power of the story. It offers us resolution. Just do what is right by the children. If I were to sum up the purpose of this book or explain its political agenda, it would be to underline the urgency of this imperative. Put simply, Canada cannot afford to squander the potential of another generation of Indigenous children. So, Treaty 9 is the treaty that represents the regions of far north of Ontario. It was signed in 1905, 1906. Duncan Campbell Scott, the notorious, not the originator of the residential schools, but the man who certainly perfected their evil, signed the treaty in Fort Albany and Moose Factory in 1905. And the promise they put on the table was education. And I find that a profound moment because the Cree, Ojibwe, and Oji-Cree people knew their way of life was under enormous threat. And they were hoping that the treaty would bring some kind of ability to put things, to at least hold the line with the settler incursions. And so the promise of education was seen by the elders as an opportunity for the young people to be able to survive in the next generation. What Treaty 9 gave Ontario was it turned Ontario into an economic powerhouse from being an economic backwater. The transfer of resources of gold, hydro, timber, transformed Ontario and Toronto in particularly within a few short years. What happened to the people of Treaty 9 was that they were taken from their lands and placed on internal displacement camps, which are called reserves. And there's no accident that the number of states of emergencies that go on in Treaty 9, from collapse of infrastructure, from the failure of health, to the failure of education that goes on today. In fact, and since I've been elected, I've lost count of how many states of emergency, is because these communities were never established to survive. They were holding places to move people so that the resources could be achieved. I start off with the story of the signing of Treaty 9 because I've learned a lot about how the education system of today is tied very directly to the signing of the treaty. In that, I received 1,200 pages of government access to information documents that I hadn't actually asked for. I was trying to find out why the government was suppressing evidence of the criminal activities that went on at St. Anne's Residential School. St. Anne's Residential School was Duncan Campbell Scott's notion of education. It is a black shadow that burns across the communities I represent. The torture and abuse of children is ongoing today through the suppression of evidence and the hearings that have gone on, and it's under the Truth and Reconciliation that was supposed to be handled. Criminal activities by federal Justice Department officials to this day suppressing evidence and denying claims of people whose only crime was that they were children. And so I was trying to find out how it is in 2016 government officials could be suppressing evidence of serial pedophiles and torturers that brutalize the children in these communities. And the government sent me all these documents, and I began to go through them. And you see that the system of education that was set up then follows a similar pattern today. Duncan Campbell Scott said in 1905, after signing the treaty don't need proper education. And what they did was they set the pattern for funding so low that it was impossible to provide proper education even if you wanted to. They looked at what the bare minimum of service was, and then they lowered it, which was why in the Western schools there were death rates of 24 to 69% of children. They were virtual death camps, but they were established that way by government policy. The government policy existed on two platforms. One is they wanted to offload the responsibility. They refused to recognize their responsibility, which is why they used the churches. And secondly, to set the transfer payments so low that it was impossible in some cases for the children to even survive. So fast forward to Attawapiskat. Children being educated on a toxic dump site in broken down portables. How is it possible in 21st century that children could be treated in such an abhorrent manner? It's because the pattern of education funding in the federal government remains the same. They look at what the province standards are. In a school like in Timmins, perhaps it's about $16,000 per child per capita. That's how the provincial funding model works. In Attawapiskat, it's $8,000 per child. So when you add the isolation and all the other factors, they don't have textbooks, they share them. They don't have libraries. They don't have robotics classes. These are considered unnecessary frills by the Department of Indian Affairs. So from the beginning, the children are denied basic rights. And the fight that Shannon led, I think, is an enormous moment. It was the first time a young Indigenous leader was able to challenge directly the power of government and speak out against this inequity. Right now, Canada has just been found guilty at the Human Rights Tribunal of systemic racial discrimination against children. This happened last March. And there was a further finding by the Federal Court of Human Rights Tribunal that Canada is not in compliance. They're refusing to respond. Well, no, they're not refusing to respond. They're saying all kinds of very positive things, but they're not dealing with the fundamental issues. So I'm going to talk to you just about a few areas where you need to pay attention to how the discrimination is happening. In terms of delivery of health services, we have, again, two standards across this country. So in education is delivered through the provinces, and it has delivered some of the greatest public education in the world. In terms of Indigenous communities on reserve, it's delivered by the federal government. It's the same in health services. We have a system of health across this country that there are problems with, but it's one of the greatest in the world. Indigenous communities have to go through Health Canada time and time again. So I'm going to give you two comparisons. 2013 was the very first time that the federal government under Indigenous Affairs Department ever bothered to check the numeracy and literacy rates in schools. I was a school board trustee. If you did that in the provincial system and you had that failure to follow up on whether children actually succeed, people would be fired. They deserve to be fired. Indian Affairs found in Ontario region that the numeracy and literacy rates for Indigenous children on reserves were down at 21 and 23%. Now, I'm not an educator, but you couldn't find a place anywhere in the world, maybe sub-Saharan Africa, that had literacy rates that low. And as they pointed that out in their departmental briefing, they said that they felt that they would actually not continue with this because they could spend the money better elsewhere. Which means whenever Indian Affairs finds out how bad they're doing a job, they don't bother to keep tracking it. So, and this was under their, I think, they had some kind of gibberish like, you know, strong schools, successful outcomes was the heading that defined that level of inequity in education. In terms of health services, when the day the Human Rights Tribunal came down, a young Cree girl from Treaty 8 was denied for the third time treatment for orthodontic surgery to keep her teeth from falling out. Do you know what the refusal rates at Health Canada are for orthodontic surgery for children on reserve? Second stage, 99% denial rates. If you get to the third stage, it's 100%. Think about that. How could that be anything other than a systemic plan to deny children basic health care? Last week I found out that a young child out in Treaty 3 area was denied an audiology test. Audiology tests are very important. My daughter was born deaf. You have to find out as soon as possible because they told us when my daughter was found out at age 2 that we were already behind the 8 ball, that she might never be able to even get into proper school unless we move quickly. This child was denied an audiology exam by someone at Health Canada. They don't even sign. They just scrawl on a fax. Somebody scrawled on a fax, a bureaucrat, that said, the child can wait till they're 4 or 6 and we'll see if there's a problem. That is systemic racial discrimination against children. At the Human Rights Tribunal that Cindy Blackstock brought forward, we received a number of documents that identify the extent of this racial discrimination in terms of the systemic denial for children who have severe disabilities, for example. They will not pay for an electric wheelchair. You get an adult push wheelchair. That's part of the policy. 2012, there's a document that was delivered to the Human Rights Tribunal, and it was one of the most shocking things I'd ever seen. It was the story of a 4-year-old girl who had a severe cardiac arrest and was left completely incapacitated. She needed all these special mechanisms to keep her alive. So the report that was to the Human Rights Tribunal documented about a dozen health and welfare agencies, provincial and federal, who had responsibility to find out if this child could be returned home to her family. But she needed this special bed to keep her from suffocating. And scrawled on the document, again, no signature, no responsibility, from Health Canada, it says absolutely not. Absolutely not. As though this child was some kind of chintzer trying to rip off the taxpayer. The sense of indignation that you see in this Health Canada official denying a child a bed that would keep them from suffocating. The doctor had to pay out of his own pocket for the bed. So I step back sometimes and I think, are these people who make these decisions, are they that brutal and mean-spirited, or are they just good civil servants? They're soccer moms and soccer dads. Imagine if they went into Emerge and were told that their kid was absolutely not, no, your child might suffocate, we're not going to help you. They'd never put up with it. But these are the policies, and they hide behind the policies because that's their job. We need to look at this. Right now we're in the, you're probably aware of Attawapiskat because of the suicide crisis that we've had. We've had a suicide crisis in community after community. These things just don't happen. Same way that murdered and missing women just don't happen. They're part of a much larger systemic problem of denial. In 2009, we had a horrific suicide crisis in Moose Factory, James Bay. You probably didn't even hear about it. We didn't get any media attention until the provincial child welfare agency began to fire all their frontline staff in the middle of the suicide crisis, where we had lost 13 young people in one winter. And the reason they were firing them was because they'd already spent their budget for the year. Well, they spent their budget for the year because they were working around the clock to try and keep children alive. And so there was an article in the Toronto Star, there was pressure, and so then the province backed off and they brought in, they were going to add emergency workers. And then once the suicide crisis left, or quietened down for a bit, they fired all those frontline workers. So this past winter, young Sheridan Hukama, age 13, gave up. Homeless child, sick from the contaminations in the mold, died at age 13 in a brutal death in Attawapiskat. That set off this latest round of hopelessness. And we had no child welfare workers. Many of the communities, we don't have places to send them. And if, in fact, they're routinely denied treatment by federal officials. So, you know, suicide is a contagion. Whenever it happens in a non-native school, there's a plan to go immediately to try and sort of inoculate. You have to bring in the people to talk to the young people, to reassure them. But in communities where you don't have that, it starts to spread. In James Bay, in the northern part of my riding, we've had 700 plus suicide attempts since 2009. And we're fighting now to get, 2 mental health workers in Attawapiskat? So these are the inequities that we have to face. Now I'm being told, well, change is coming and you got to be patient, and if it's not in this budget, it's next budget. I don't believe that anymore. It's a matter of political will. What kind of nation squanders its children? I don't believe that, well, it's not in this budget, we'll put it in the next budget, or, well, things are better than they were. They aren't good enough. Because, when I go to James Bay, my riding, it's an incredible ride. You fly up and go for hours and hours and hours and hours. You see nothing but the incredible land of the Cree who lived there for thousands of years. And there's a diamond mine there. I always wonder, how the hell did they find those diamonds? There's no roads. There's no services. But when they found those diamonds, they turned the world upside down to build a state-of-the-art camp. Clean water, all the best provisions. They got a road in where you could never get a road in. Just down the road, there's a little Attawapiskat, like a fourth world shanty shack town, where they still can't figure out how we're going to get them a few more mental health workers. And the issue I put to you as adults, in terms of what reconciliation means, is that Canada will never be the country it was meant to be until we recognize that the greatest wealth we have in this country is not the gold, it's not the oil, it's the children. And unless we put those children first and foremost now and say, as Cindy Blackstock says, a Marshall Plan, to put those resources in, to give them the hope, to give them the opportunities, because this is the bill that comes due with reconciliation. Edmund Matatawaban, who speaks for the survivors of St. Anne's, says there's a direct highway from the abuse at St. Anne's to the suicide crisis of today. Reconciliation means that we're going to finally say the children aren't going to wait any longer. I'm just going to end with a final reading, short little reading. Am I running out of time? You're going to throw me off the stage in a few minutes? Okay. I want to go back because, as I say, I have enormous faith in the young people. I've been speaking at schools across the country where young people are organizing. And I'm most fascinated by some of these schools. I've been in South Ottawa, where we have 90% first-generation Muslim immigrant kids from Syria, Iraq, Yemen. And their role model is Shannon Kustashian. I'm blown away when I go meet these kids. They have Shannon Kustashian clubs, these kids, because they believe change is happening and they're going to be part of it. That gives me hope for the future. Our role as adults is to help those young people. So I'm going to end on this Would building First Nation schools and protecting interests of Indigenous youth be enough to address the historical breach between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in Canada? No, perhaps not, but it would be a damn good start. What I've learned from the treaties is that First Nation and non-First Nation people are bound together in a relationship. This is Canada's primary relationship. Duncan Campbell Scott said it will last so long as the grass grows and the water runs. And for many decades now, it has been a dysfunctional and at times a hostile relationship. None of us can change what happened before, but we all have the power to decide what kind of relationship will exist in the future. This is perhaps another reason why I think so much of Shannon. She was a young woman who refused to have her dreams limited by the system. She believed the Canadian people were better than the miserly limitations imposed by the federal government. She believed that by reaching out to Canadians, reconciliation and change are possible, and I believe that too. Shannon taught me to see the issues of First Nation inequity through the eyes of a child. She knew that children had only one childhood, and once it's gone, it can never be brought back. This realization was the driving force behind everything that she did in fighting for the younger brothers and sisters coming in her wake. Shannon had a burning urgency because she saw the issue from the perspective of a disappearing childhood. Students across Canada have instinctively understood this urgency, and we can learn from them that children can't wait. Canada will never be the country it was meant to be until it recognizes the obligation that all children of the treaty, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, can live in a country where their dreams and hopes are nurtured and protected. This was Shannon's dream, and with goodwill, we can get there. Thank you very much.